Cedar Falls Territory, Montana, 1881. The territorial records building burned to the ground on a windless Tuesday morning, taking with it every land deed, treaty document, and legal record that defined ownership across 3 counties. Within hours, disputes erupted over property lines that had stood unchallenged for decades. Mining claims vanished into ash. Homestead rights dissolved into memory. Ranch boundaries became matters of deadly contention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As smoke still rose from the smoldering ruins, territorial officials faced an impossible task: reconstruct 15 years of legal documentation from nothing. But in a modest cabin, on the outskirts of town, a quiet woman named Elizabeth Campbell possessed something no fire could destroy. Her mind contained every word of every document that had ever passed through those offices, every treaty negotiation, every surveyor's report, every deed transfer. She was about to become the most dangerous person in the territory. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Elizabeth Campbell swept the front porch of her small cabin. At 28, Beth possessed an unremarkable appearance that allowed her to move through Cedar Falls virtually unnoticed. Her brown hair was always neatly pinned, her dresses practical and well-mended, her demeanor quiet and unassuming. What the townspeople didn't know was that behind her modest exterior lay a mind capable of perfect recall. Beth had discovered her unusual gift as a child. While other children forgot their lessons the moment they left the schoolhouse, she retained every word her teacher spoke, every passage from every book, every conversation she overheard. By age 10, she could recite entire church sermons verbatim. By 15, she had memorized the complete contents of her father's law books. Now at 28, her mind held an extraordinary repository of information about Cedar Falls Territory. The gift had its burdens. Beth remembered every slight, every cruel word, every moment of pain with the same clarity as happy memories. She had learned early to keep her abilities secret, understanding instinctively that such a talent would make her either a curiosity or a threat. So she lived quietly, working as a seamstress, keeping house for herself in the cabin her parents had left her, and observing the world with careful attention. On this particular morning, as Beth arranged her sewing supplies, she noticed unusual activity at the far end of Main Street. A crowd had gathered near the territorial building, their voices carrying an undercurrent of alarm. Setting aside her work, she walked toward the commotion, her steps measured and unhurried. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. Where the territorial records building had stood yesterday, only charred timbers and smoking ash remained. The entire structure had been reduced to rubble, and with it, every official document that had shaped the legal landscape of Cedar Falls Territory. James Patterson, editor of the Cedar Falls Chronicle, stood at the edge of the crowd, scribbling notes in his leather-bound notebook. At 35, Jim was a transplant from Chicago who had come west seeking adventure and found instead a calling in frontier journalism. His brown hair perpetually looked as though he had run his fingers through it while chasing the story, and his clothes bore the ink stains of a man who lived and breathed in newsprint. Complete destruction, Jim was saying to Sheriff Frank Cooper. Not a single document survived. The fire burned too hot, too evenly. This wasn't an accident, Frank. Sheriff Cooper, a weathered man in his 40s with steel-gray hair and skeptical blue eyes, surveyed the ruins with obvious frustration. You saying someone deliberately burned down the territorial building, Patterson? Look at the burn pattern, Jim insisted, pointing to the debris. The fire started simultaneously in multiple locations. Someone wanted to make sure nothing survived. Beth moved closer, listening to their conversation while studying the destruction herself. Her memory immediately recalled every detail of the building's interior. The main records room had contained oak filing cabinets arranged in precise rows. The treaty documents had been stored in a fireproof safe in the back office. The land deeds had occupied an entire wall of shelving, organized by county and date. All of it was now ash and twisted metal. "The real question," Jim continued, "is who benefits from destroying 15 years of territorial records?" As if summoned by the question, William Hayes appeared at the edge of the crowd. At 42, Hayes cut an imposing figure in Cedar Falls society. His tailored suits were the finest money could buy. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his pale blue eyes held a calculating intelligence that made people uncomfortable. As owner of Hayes Land Company, he had his fingers in every major property transaction in the territory. "Gentlemen," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and position. "A tragic accident, but not an insurmountable obstacle. My company maintains detailed surveys of most properties in the territory. Perhaps we can assist in reconstruction efforts." Beth watched Hayes with careful attention. She remembered every interaction she had witnessed between him and various townspeople over the years. His offers to help widows sell their late husbands' claims. His suggestions to struggling farmers about the value of their land. His presence at every public land auction, somehow always informed about the best parcels before they became available. "That's generous of you, Hayes," Sheriff Cooper replied, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Course, your surveys only cover properties you've had business with, which fortunately includes most of the valuable land in 3 counties. Hayes smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I've always believed in maintaining thorough documentation." Judge Thomas Miller arrived as Hayes was speaking. At 58, Miller was one of the few territorial officials who commanded universal respect in Cedar Falls. His white beard and dignified bearing gave him the appearance of biblical authority, while his reputation for fairness had earned him the trust of settlers and tribal representatives alike. He surveyed the destruction with obvious dismay. "This is catastrophic," Miller announced to the gathered crowd. "Without proper documentation, every land dispute will become a matter of competing claims and fading memories. We'll have chaos within the week." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Surely not that dire, Your Honor," Hayes interjected smoothly. "Between my company's records and the testimony of longtime residents, we should be able to establish most boundaries and ownership rights." Beth felt a chill of unease at Hayes' words. She remembered conversations she had overheard about his business practices, about properties that somehow found their way into his company's portfolio after their original owners faced financial difficulties. She also remembered seeing him in deep conversation with men who didn't look like legitimate businessmen, their meetings taking place in locations where honest dealings wouldn't require secrecy. "The problem," Judge Miller explained to the crowd, "is that memory is unreliable. Men remember property lines in their favor. Witnesses forget crucial details. Without written documentation, we have no objective standard for resolving disputes." As if to prove his point, 2 ranchers immediately began arguing about the boundary between their properties. Within minutes, their disagreement had escalated to shouted accusations and threats of violence. Sheriff Cooper stepped between them, but Beth could see the worry in his eyes. If 2 neighbors could come to blows over a fence line, what would happen when major mining claims and railroad rights-of-way came into dispute? The crowd began to disperse as people hurried home to gather whatever documents they might have in their possession. Beth lingered, studying the ruins and thinking about what she had witnessed. Her perfect memory contained detailed recollections of countless documents she had seen over the years. Treaties negotiated in the town hall, deeds recorded at the courthouse, survey maps discussed in public meetings, mining claims filed and approved. She possessed, in her mind, a complete backup of much of what had been destroyed. but revealing. Her gift would change everything about her quiet life. She would become the center of attention, subjected to constant demands for information, tested and questioned until her privacy disappeared entirely. Worse, if someone had deliberately destroyed the records, they might view her memory as an obstacle to their plans. James Patterson approached her as she stood contemplating the ruins. "Miss Campbell, isn't it? You live over on Elm Street?" "That's right," Beth replied quietly. "Elizabeth Campbell. I'm working on a story about the fire for tomorrow's edition. Did you notice anything unusual last night? Any strangers in town? Strange sounds? Anything out of the ordinary?" Beth considered his question carefully. She had indeed noticed something the previous evening. Around midnight, she had been awakened by the sound of horses moving through town at an unusually late hour. Looking out her window, she observed 3 riders heading toward the territorial building. They had moved with purpose, not like drunken cowboys or late travelers, but like men on specific business. She had thought it odd at the time, but had returned to bed without dwelling on it. "I heard horses around midnight," she said finally. 3 riders moving toward the center of town. Jim's pencil moved across his notebook. "Did you recognize any of them?" It was too dark to see faces, but one of the horses was distinctive. A large bay with white markings on its front legs. Not many horses like that in Cedar Falls. "Interesting," Jim mused. "Thank you, Miss Campbell. If you remember anything else, please let me know." As Jim moved away to interview other potential witnesses, Beth noticed William Hayes watching her from across the street. His pale eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity, as though he were calculating something. The look lasted only a moment before he turned away to speak with another businessman, but it left Beth with a profound sense of unease. That afternoon, Beth returned to her cabin to find Mary Johnson, her elderly neighbor, waiting on the front porch. At 73, Mary was one of the original settlers in Cedar Falls, having arrived with her late husband during the first wave of homesteaders. Her weathered face bore the marks of frontier hardship, but her blue eyes remained sharp and alert. "Beth, dear," Mary said, rising from her seat on the porch steps, "I've been thinking about this terrible fire. You know, there are people who might try to take advantage of the confusion." "What do you mean?" Beth asked, though she suspected she already knew. Mary glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "That Hayes fellow has been sniffing around properties for months, making offers to people who might not understand the true value of their land. With all the records gone, it would be mighty convenient if certain inconvenient details about property rights just disappeared." Beth invited Mary inside for tea, and the older woman continued her concerns in the privacy of the cabin's small kitchen. "My late husband always said that Hayes reminded him of the land grabbers back east. The kind of men who got rich during the war by buying up properties from widows who didn't know what they owned." "Do you think he might have had something to do with the fire?" Beth asked carefully. Mary was quiet for a long moment, stirring honey into her tea. "I think there are men in this territory who would profit from chaos, dear. And I think you should be careful about who you trust in the coming days." As evening approached, Beth found herself unable to concentrate on her sewing. Mary's warnings echoed in her mind, combining with her own observations of Hayes' behavior and her memory of the midnight riders. She decided to take a walk through town, hoping that movement would help clarify her thoughts. Cedar Falls in the twilight was a place of remarkable beauty. The surrounding mountains caught the last rays of sunlight, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The Whitewater River ran clean and clear through the valley, its gentle sound providing a peaceful backdrop to the town's evening routines. Families gathered on their porches to enjoy the cooling air. Children played in the streets until their mothers called them home for supper. But beneath the pastoral tranquility, Beth sensed growing tension. Small groups of men stood in hushed conversation outside the Prairie Rose Saloon. Homesteaders who had been neighbors for years eyed each other with new suspicion. The absence of legal documentation had created an atmosphere of uncertainty that touched every aspect of community life. Beth's walk took her past the Methodist church where Minister Henry Walker was tending to his small garden behind the parsonage. At 45, Walker was a thoughtful man whose sermons emphasized practical Christianity and community cooperation. He had arrived in Cedar Falls 3 years earlier, and had quickly established himself as a voice of moral authority in the growing settlement. "Good evening, Miss Campbell," Walker called out, straightening from his work among the tomato plants. "Terrible business about the fire." "Yes, it is," Beth replied, pausing by the garden gate. "I imagine it will cause considerable hardship for many families." Walker's expression grew troubled. "I've had 3 separate visitors today, all asking me to testify about property boundaries based on conversations they claim to have had with me. The problem is, I remember those conversations differently than they do, and I suspect none of us has the complete truth." "Memory can be uncertain," Beth agreed, though the irony of her words was not lost on her. "Indeed, which is why I've been thinking that perhaps the Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps this disaster is meant to teach us something about the importance of truth and honest dealing." Beth found herself studying the minister's earnest face. Henry Walker had a reputation for integrity that was unusual in frontier communities. If anyone could be trusted with knowledge of her gift, he might be the one. But even as the thought occurred to her, she dismissed it. The fewer people who knew about her memory, the safer she would be. "I suppose we'll all learn to adapt," she said diplomatically. As she prepared to continue her walk, Walker called after her. "Miss Campbell, if you don't mind my asking, you've lived in Cedar Falls your entire life, haven't you?" "Yes, I was born here." "Then you've witnessed the growth of this community from the beginning. You've seen the changes, the challenges, the way people have worked together to build something lasting." Walker paused, choosing his words carefully. "In times of crisis, sometimes the Lord places certain people in positions where they can serve a greater purpose. People with special knowledge or abilities that can help their community." Beth felt her heart race. Did Walker suspect something about her memory? Was he testing her, or merely making conversation? "I'm just a seamstress, Minister Walker. I don't think I have any special abilities that could help with legal disputes." Walker smiled gently. "Perhaps not. But if you did, I hope you would remember that with great gifts come great responsibilities." The conversation left Beth deeply unsettled. As she walked home through the gathering darkness, she found herself wondering how many other people had noticed something unusual about her over the years. She had always been careful to hide her gift, but perfect memory sometimes manifested in ways that were difficult to disguise. Back in her cabin, Beth lit a single oil lamp and sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. Around her, the familiar objects of her daily life seemed to offer comfort and stability in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. Her mother's china teacups, her father's law books, the quilt her grandmother had sewn decades earlier. These tangible connections to the past felt precious now that so much of the territory's documented history had vanished. But as she sat in the lamplight, Beth's extraordinary mind began to catalog everything she remembered about the destroyed records. Deed transfers dating back to the earliest homestead claims, mining permits granted and denied, treaty negotiations between territorial officials and tribal representatives, railroad survey reports, water rights agreements, tax assessments, court judgments, marriage licenses, death certificates. Every document that had passed through official channels in Cedar Falls Territory existed somewhere in her memory. The magnitude of what she possessed was staggering. She was, quite literally, a living library of the territory's legal and social history. The question was whether that knowledge would prove to be a blessing or a curse in the days to come. Outside her window, Cedar Falls slept fitfully under a canopy of stars. Somewhere in the darkness, men were already making plans to profit from the confusion caused by the fire. Property lines would be redrawn, claims would be disputed, fortunes would be made and lost based on competing versions of history. Elizabeth Campbell closed her eyes and allowed her perfect memory to flow through 15 years of accumulated knowledge. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was still just a seamstress living quietly in a frontier town. Tonight her secret was still safe. The sound of horses approaching through the darkness interrupted her reverie. Beth extinguished her lamp and moved to the window, peering carefully through the curtains. 3 riders moved slowly down Elm Street, their faces hidden beneath hat brims pulled low. As they passed beneath the streetlight at the corner, she caught a glimpse of the lead horse, a large bay with distinctive white markings on its front legs, the same horse she had seen the night of the fire. Beth retreated from the window, her heart pounding. The riders continued past her cabin without stopping, but their presence felt like a warning. Someone was watching, someone was planning, and somehow, she suspected her quiet life was about to become much more complicated. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. The fire that had destroyed Cedar Falls Territory's official records was only the beginning. The real battle for the soul of the community was about to begin, and Elizabeth Campbell, with her extraordinary memory and dangerous knowledge, stood at the center of it all. Whether she wanted to or not, the living library of Cedar Falls Territory was about to be opened to the world. Dawn brought no relief to the tensions gripping Cedar Falls Territory. Elizabeth Campbell woke to the sound of raised voices from the street, where 2 homesteaders were already arguing over a disputed creek that had served as their property boundary for 8 years. Without the burned records to confirm the original survey, each man claimed the water rights based on his own recollection of the agreement. Beth dressed quickly in a simple brown dress and white apron, pinning her hair into its customary neat bun. As she prepared breakfast, her mind automatically cataloged every detail she remembered about the disputed creek. She recalled the original survey conducted by territorial engineer Marcus Whitman in 1874, the precise measurements he had recorded, even the weather conditions on the day he had marked the boundary stones. But revealing such specific knowledge would immediately expose her unusual gift. A sharp knock at her front door interrupted her thoughts. Beth opened it to find James Patterson standing on her porch, his notebook already in hand, and his brown eyes alert with journalistic curiosity. "Miss Campbell, forgive the early hour, but I wondered if you might have remembered any additional details about those midnight riders you mentioned yesterday." Beth invited him inside for coffee, grateful for any distraction from her internal debates about whether to reveal her memory. As she poured steaming coffee into 2 cups, she found herself studying Patterson more carefully. His clothes were well made but showed the wear of a working journalist. Ink stains marked his fingers, and his leather satchel bulged with papers and notebooks. He carried himself with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to asking difficult questions and expecting honest answers. "I've been thinking about what you said," Beth began carefully, "and I remembered something else. The horses weren't just moving through town, they stopped near the territorial building for several minutes before moving on." Patterson's pencil scratched across his notebook. "You observed this from your window?" "Yes, though I didn't think much of it at the time. Late travelers often stop to get their bearings, especially on dark nights. But these riders seemed to know exactly where they were going." Beth nodded, pouring cream into her coffee. "They moved with purpose, not like men who were lost or unsure of their destination." Patterson leaned forward slightly, his reporter's instincts clearly engaged. "Miss Campbell, you seem to have an excellent memory for details. Have you noticed anything else unusual in recent weeks? Strangers in town, private meetings, anything that might relate to the fire?" The question caught Beth off guard. Patterson's casual observation about her memory felt dangerously perceptive. She forced herself to remain calm, stirring her coffee with deliberate slowness while she considered her response. "I suppose I do pay attention to what happens around me," she said finally. "Living alone, you learn to notice things that might be important for your safety." "Of course, and what have you noticed?" Beth felt as though she were walking along the edge of a precipice. Every word might either preserve her secret or expose it entirely. Yet Patterson's questions suggested he was investigating the fire as more than just an accident, and his knowledge might prove crucial in the days ahead. "William Hayes has been having more private meetings lately,"
she said carefully. Men arriving at his office after dark, leaving before dawn. Not the sort of schedule you'd expect for legitimate land transactions. Patterson's eyes sharpened with interest. Can you describe any of these men? Beth allowed herself to access her perfect recall, selecting details that would seem observant but not impossibly precise. One was a large man with a gray beard and expensive clothes. He arrived twice in the past month, always after sunset. Another was younger, maybe 30, with distinctive red hair and a scar across his left hand. He came 3 times that I know of. When was the last time you saw either of them? The red-haired man was at Hayes' office 2 nights before the fire. He stayed until nearly midnight. Patterson made detailed notes, occasionally looking up to study Beth's face with obvious curiosity. You have remarkable powers of observation, Miss Campbell. Most people wouldn't notice such specific details about strangers. The compliment felt like another step toward the precipice. I suppose it comes from living quietly. When you don't have much excitement in your own life, you tend to notice what's happening around you. Before Patterson could pursue the topic further, another knock sounded at Beth's door. This time her visitor was Daniel Whitebear, a Lakota historian, who served as an interpreter and cultural liaison between the tribal communities and Cedar Falls Territorial government. At 38, Daniel possessed the dignified bearing of a man who walked comfortably between 2 worlds. His dark hair was neatly braided, and he wore a combination of traditional beadwork and practical frontier clothing. Beth had encountered Daniel numerous times over the years, particularly during treaty negotiations and cultural exchanges. She remembered every conversation she had witnessed him conduct. His careful translations that often revealed subtle differences between what tribal leaders said and what territorial officials heard. Miss Campbell, Daniel said politely, removing his hat as he entered the cabin. Mr. Patterson, I hoped I might speak with both of you about the fire. Please sit down, Beth offered, fetching another coffee cup. How can we help you? Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully before continuing. The burned records contain several treaties between the territorial government and various tribal bands. These agreements established hunting rights, fishing access, and seasonal gathering permissions that affect many families. Without the original documents, some officials are claiming that certain understandings were never formally recorded. Patterson leaned forward, his notebook ready. Which officials? Nathan Cross, the territorial secretary, has suggested that some tribal access rights were based on verbal agreements that lack legal standing. He's proposed new negotiations to establish what he calls more appropriate boundaries. Beth felt a chill of recognition. She remembered every word of the treaties Daniel was discussing. More than that, she recalled the private conversations she had overheard between Cross and various businessmen, including William Hayes, about the potential value of restricting tribal access to certain areas rich in timber and mineral deposits. That seems suspiciously convenient timing, Patterson observed. New negotiations right after the documentation disappears. Daniel nodded grimly. My grandfather always said that some men will use any crisis to advance their own interests. The fire may have been an accident, but the response to it reveals true intentions. What kind of response? Beth asked, though she suspected she already knew. Claims that certain lands were never properly ceded to tribal use. Suggestions that hunting and fishing rights were temporary concessions rather than permanent agreements. Proposals to consolidate all tribal access into smaller, more controlled areas. Patterson's pencil moved rapidly across his notebook. Has anyone challenged these claims? Judge Miller has insisted that any changes to existing agreements require proper legal process, but without the original documents, that process becomes much more difficult. It becomes a matter of competing memories and interested testimony. Beth set down her coffee cup, her mind racing. She possessed perfect recall of every treaty negotiation she had witnessed. She could recite the exact terms of tribal access agreements, the specific language that had been carefully crafted to protect both territorial and tribal interests. But revealing such detailed knowledge would expose her gift and potentially put her in danger from men who were clearly willing to use extreme methods to achieve their goals. There must be copies somewhere, she said carefully. Surely the tribal communities kept records of such important agreements. Daniel shook his head sadly. Some oral traditions preserve the spirit of the agreements, but the legal language that white courts require was recorded only in the territorial offices. Without those documents, we face the possibility that 15 years of careful negotiation and compromise will simply be declared invalid. The magnitude of the potential injustice struck Beth forcefully. Families who had depended on treaty-guaranteed access to traditional hunting and gathering areas might find themselves suddenly denied rights they had exercised for years. Communities that had made substantial concessions in exchange for specific protections might discover that those protections no longer existed in any legally recognizable form. What would new negotiations mean for the tribal communities? Patterson asked. Probably significant losses, Daniel replied honestly. The men pushing for renegotiation represent interests that see tribal access rights as obstacles to development. They would likely demand much more restrictive terms in exchange for any continuing access. Beth found herself studying Daniel's weathered face, noting the worry lines around his eyes and the tension in his posture. This was a man facing the potential destruction of agreements his people had negotiated in good faith. Agreements that represented delicate balances between traditional ways of life and the rapidly changing territorial landscape. Is there anything that could be done to preserve the existing agreements? She asked quietly. Only if someone could provide detailed testimony about the original terms, Daniel replied. But such testimony would need to be extraordinarily precise to stand up in court. Most people remember general concepts, not the specific legal language that makes agreements enforceable. The conversation continued for another hour, with Patterson asking detailed questions about the political implications of the destroyed treaties, and Daniel providing careful answers that revealed both his diplomatic experience and his deep concern for his community's future. Beth listened carefully, her perfect memory automatically cross-referencing their discussion with her recollections of the actual treaty negotiations. After Daniel departed, Patterson remained in Beth's kitchen, reviewing his notes and occasionally glancing at her with obvious curiosity. You seem very well informed about territorial politics for someone who describes herself as just a seamstress, he observed casually. Beth felt her cheeks warm slightly. I listen when people talk. In a small community, everyone's business tends to become public knowledge eventually. True, but your questions showed more than casual interest. You seem to understand the legal implications of treaty disputes better than most lawyers. The observation was accurate and dangerous. Beth had indeed asked questions that revealed her understanding of complex legal concepts, understanding that came from her perfect recall of her father's law books and countless overheard conversations about territorial jurisprudence. My father was a lawyer before he died, she said, which was true as far as it went. I grew up hearing legal discussions around the dinner table. Patterson nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, but Beth could see that he was filing away every detail of their conversation for future consideration. As a journalist, he was trained to notice inconsistencies and unusual knowledge, exactly the kind of attention she had spent years trying to avoid. After Patterson left, Beth found herself unable to concentrate on her sewing. The morning's conversations had crystallized her understanding of the crisis facing Cedar Falls Territory. The fire had created a legal vacuum that unscrupulous men were already moving to exploit. Property rights would be disputed based on convenient recollections. Treaty obligations would be minimized or denied entirely. The careful balance between competing interests that had taken years to establish would be swept away in favor of the most powerful and ruthless claimants. She possessed the knowledge to prevent much of this injustice. Her memory contained the precise terms of property deeds, the exact language of treaty agreements, the specific boundaries established by official surveys. But using that knowledge would expose her gift, and likely put her life in danger from men who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy public records to achieve their goals. The internal struggle continued through the afternoon as Beth attempted to focus on her sewing. She was working on a dress for Susan Baker, the territorial school teacher, when another knock interrupted her concentration. This time her visitor was Mary Johnson, her elderly neighbor, accompanied by Frank Cooper, the territorial sheriff. "Beth dear," Mary said as they entered, "Sheriff Cooper wanted to speak with you about what you observed the night of the fire." Cooper was a practical man who had served as a lawman for over 20 years before coming to Cedar Falls Territory. His weathered face bore the marks of countless difficult decisions, and his gray eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating truth and deception. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who relied more on reputation than bluster to maintain order. "Miss Campbell," Cooper said, settling his considerable frame into one of Beth's kitchen chairs, "I understand you witnessed some unusual activity the night the territorial building burned." Beth repeated her account of the midnight riders, providing the same level of detail she had shared with Patterson. Cooper listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his experience in conducting investigations. "The horse with white markings," he said finally. "That's fairly distinctive. Do you know of any horses matching that description in Cedar Falls?" Beth considered the question carefully. Her memory contained detailed recollections of hundreds of horses she had observed over the years, but identifying the specific animal might reveal more than she was prepared to disclose. "I've seen similar markings on horses owned by various people," she said diplomatically. "It's not uncommon for bays to have white on their legs, but this particular combination of markings on a large bay. Have you seen that specific horse before?" The question pressed directly against Beth's dilemma. She had indeed seen that exact horse before, multiple times, tied behind Hayes' office during those late-night meetings she had mentioned to Patterson. But providing such specific identification would require her to admit to a level of observational detail that might seem suspicious. "I might have seen it around town," she said carefully, "but I couldn't say for certain where or when." Cooper nodded, making notes in his own leather-bound notebook. Mary Johnson watched the exchange with obvious interest, her sharp blue eyes moving between Beth and the sheriff with the alertness of someone who understood more than she was saying. "Miss Campbell," Cooper continued, "have you noticed anything else unusual in recent weeks? Any changes in people's behavior, unexpected visitors, private meetings, anything that might be relevant to our investigation?" The question echoed Patterson's earlier inquiry, suggesting that both men suspected the fire was more than a simple accident. Beth found herself walking the same careful line between helpfulness and self-preservation. "William Hayes has been conducting more business after regular hours," she said. "Men coming and going at unusual times. It might mean nothing, but it seemed worth mentioning." "What kind of men?" "I didn't recognize them as locals. Well-dressed but not like typical businessmen. They carried themselves more like soldiers or," she paused, searching for the right word, "like men accustomed to violence," Cooper suggested. "Perhaps. They moved with a certain wariness, as though they were used to watching for threats." Cooper's expression grew more serious. "When was the most recent of these meetings?" "2 nights before the fire. One man stayed until after midnight. Can you describe him?" Beth provided the same description she had given Patterson, noting Cooper's increased attention when she mentioned the red hair and scarred hand. The sheriff's reaction suggested that the description might be significant, though he didn't explain why. "Miss Campbell," Cooper said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to be careful in the coming days. If someone deliberately set that fire, they might not appreciate witnesses coming forward with information." The warning sent a chill through Beth's thoughts. She had been so focused on the moral implications of hiding her knowledge that she hadn't fully considered the physical danger her observations might create. Men who would burn down a territorial building might not hesitate to silence inconvenient witnesses. After Cooper and Mary departed, Beth found herself pacing restlessly through her small cabin. The weight of her secret knowledge seemed heavier with each passing hour. Outside her windows, Cedar Falls Territory struggled to maintain normal life, while fundamental questions about property rights and legal agreements remained unresolved. The sound of horses approaching drew her attention to the street. A group of 6 riders was moving slowly down Elm Street, their faces hidden beneath hat brims, and their posture suggesting watchful alertness. As they passed beneath the street light at the corner, Beth recognized the lead horse. The same large bay with distinctive white markings she had described to both Patterson and Sheriff Cooper. Her heart began racing as the implications became clear. The Midnight Riders were still in Cedar Falls Territory, and they were no longer trying to avoid observation. Their presence in broad daylight suggested either confidence that their activities couldn't be traced to them, or preparation for some new action that would make secrecy unnecessary. Beth moved away from the window and tried to calm herself with routine activities. She prepared a simple dinner of bread and soup, tended to her small garden behind the cabin, and attempted to focus on her sewing. But her perfect memory continued to replay every detail of the day's conversations, analyzing the implications and connections with relentless precision. As evening approached, she found herself thinking about Minister Walker's words from the previous day. His suggestion that perhaps the Lord placed certain people in positions where they could serve a greater purpose echoed in her mind with uncomfortable persistence. Did she have a moral obligation to use her gift to prevent injustice, even if doing so put her own safety at risk? The question remained unanswered as darkness fell over Cedar Falls Territory. Somewhere in that darkness, men were making plans that would shape the future of the community. Property lines would be redrawn based on convenient memories. Treaty rights would be renegotiated to favor the most powerful interests. The careful balance between competing claims that had maintained relative peace for 15 years would be destroyed in favor of whoever proved most ruthless in pressing their advantages. Elizabeth Campbell sat in her lamplight kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her quiet life, and contemplated the choice that was rapidly approaching. She could continue to hide her extraordinary memory and watch injustice unfold, or she could reveal her gift and accept whatever consequences followed. Outside, the same church bell that had marked midnight after the fire now chimed 9 o'clock, marking another day closer to decisions that would determine not only her own future, but the fate of everyone who called Cedar Falls Territory home. The living library sat unopened, its knowledge vast and precise, while the community it could save struggled with questions that only she could answer with certainty. The morning of the 3rd day after the fire brought news that sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls Territory. Nathan Cross, the territorial secretary, announced that the federal government was sending a special commission to investigate the destroyed records and recommend new administrative procedures for territorial governance. The commission would be headed by Senator Harrison Blackwood, a powerful Eastern politician with significant influence over territorial policy. Beth learned this information while purchasing supplies at Miller's General Store, where the announcement had become the sole topic of conversation among the gathered townspeople. The store, with its shelves of practical goods and its central location on Main Street, served as an unofficial information exchange for the community. Blackwood's got connections to the railroad companies. She overheard George Thompson, the territorial blacksmith, telling a group of ranchers, "Wouldn't surprise me if this commission ends up favoring development interests over local concerns." "That's exactly what Hayes wants," replied another man. "Federal oversight means local voices get pushed aside in favor of Eastern money." Beth moved quietly through the store, selecting the items she needed while listening carefully to the conversations around her. Her perfect memory automatically cataloged every detail she heard, from specific names mentioned to the exact phrasing of concerns expressed by different speakers. Near the back of the store, she encountered Susan Baker, the territorial school teacher, examining a selection of writing materials. At 26, Susan was one of the few educated women in Cedar Falls, having attended teachers' college in Chicago before coming west to establish the territorial school. Her intelligent brown eyes and determined manner had earned her the respect of parents and students alike. "Miss Campbell," Susan said warmly, "I was hoping to see you. I understand you witnessed some unusual activity the night of the fire." "Word travels quickly in a small community," Beth replied carefully.
Perhaps too quickly. I've heard several different versions of your account, each more dramatic than the last. People seem eager to find conspiracy where simple accident might suffice. Beth studied Susan's face, noting the teacher's characteristic precision in both speech and thought. "What makes you think it was a simple accident?" "I don't necessarily think that," Susan clarified, "but I believe in evaluating evidence carefully before reaching conclusions. Too many people seem ready to accept theories based on speculation rather than facts." The observation struck Beth as both perceptive and cautionary. As someone whose memory contained an extraordinary wealth of facts, she understood the danger of communities making decisions based on incomplete or distorted information. "What kind of evidence would you consider reliable?" Beth asked. "First-hand observations from credible witnesses. Physical evidence that can be independently verified. Documentation that existed before the crisis and therefore couldn't have been created to serve particular interests." Susan paused, selecting a box of pencils with careful deliberation. "The problem we face now is that the most important documentation has been destroyed, leaving us dependent on human memory, which is notoriously unreliable." Beth felt the familiar tension between her desire to help and her need to protect her secret. "But surely some memories are more reliable than others." "Certainly. People who were directly involved in events, who had reason to pay careful attention, who possessed the knowledge to understand what they observed. But even the best human memory tends to be influenced by personal interests and subsequent experiences." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the store. William Hayes had entered, accompanied by two men Beth didn't recognize. One was the red-haired man with the scarred hand she had described to both Patterson and Sheriff Cooper. The other was elderly but vigorous, with silver hair and expensive Eastern clothing that marked him as someone of considerable wealth and influence. Hayes moved through the store with his customary confidence, nodding to various townspeople while conducting a low-voiced conversation with his companions. As they passed near Beth and Susan, she caught fragments of their discussion. "Commission will require comprehensive documentation of all existing claims. Opportunity to establish clear title without the confusion of conflicting records. Federal authority supersedes territorial arrangements that lack proper documentation." Beth's perfect memory recorded every word, automatically cross-referencing the conversation with her knowledge of Hayes' previous statements and actions. The implications were clear. Hayes and his associates intended to use the Federal Commission as a mechanism for reshaping territorial property rights in their favor. After Hayes and his companions departed, Susan turned to Beth with obvious concern. "Did you hear what they were discussing? Something about the Federal Commission and property documentation. I'm afraid Mr. Hayes sees this crisis as an opportunity rather than a disaster. If the Commission accepts his version of territorial history, many legitimate claims could be invalidated simply because they lack written proof." Beth nodded, though she could have provided Susan with precise details about the legitimate claims Hayes hoped to challenge. Her memory contained complete records of property transfers, mining permits, and settlement agreements that Hayes would prefer to see forgotten. "What can be done to prevent such an outcome?" she asked. "Someone would need to provide the Commission with accurate information about existing property rights and agreements, but that would require an extraordinary level of detailed knowledge about 15 years of territorial records." Susan's words hung in the air like a challenge. Beth understood that the school teacher was describing exactly the kind of comprehensive testimony that her perfect memory could provide. But offering such testimony would expose her gift, and potentially put her life in danger. "Surely there are people in the community who remember important details about their own properties," Beth suggested. "Individual memories about specific properties, yes, but the Commission will need systematic information about the overall pattern of territorial development. They'll need to understand how different claims relate to each other, how boundaries were established, how conflicts were resolved.
That kind of comprehensive knowledge is extraordinarily rare. As Beth prepared to leave the store, Susan placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Miss Campbell, if I may say so, you seem unusually well informed about territorial affairs for someone who describes herself as just a seamstress. Your questions reveal a sophisticated understanding of legal and administrative processes." The observation echoed similar comments from Patterson and Sheriff Cooper, confirming Beth's fear that her attempts to help were drawing unwanted attention to her unusual knowledge. "I listen carefully when people discuss important matters," she replied, using her standard explanation. "Of course, but listening is only part of understanding. You seem to grasp implications that escape many people with much more formal education." Beth felt heat rising in her cheeks. Perhaps growing up in a frontier community teaches you to pay attention to things that affect everyone's welfare. Susan nodded, apparently accepting the explanation, but her intelligent eyes continued to study Beth with obvious curiosity. "Well, if you ever decide that your talents might be put to broader use, please remember that the Territorial School could use someone with your observational abilities to help teach local history and civics." The offer was flattering and terrifying in equal measure. Teaching would inevitably expose the full extent of Beth's knowledge, making it impossible to maintain the fiction that she was simply an attentive observer of community affairs. "That's very kind," she said diplomatically, "but I'm quite content with my current situation." Walking home through the afternoon heat, Beth found herself increasingly conscious of being observed. Men she didn't recognize seemed to be paying attention to her movements. Conversations stopped as she passed certain groups. The sensation of being watched made her skin crawl with anxiety. At her cabin, she discovered James Patterson waiting on her front porch, his expression more serious than she had seen it before. "Miss Campbell, I wonder if we might speak privately. I've learned some information that I believe you should know." Beth invited him inside, noting the tension in his posture and the careful way he glanced around before entering her home. "I've been investigating the men you described seeing at Hayes' office," Patterson began without preamble. "The red-haired man with the scarred hand is named Marcus Donnelly. He's a former soldier who now works as what people politely call a commercial problem solver." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means he intimidates people who pose obstacles to his employer's business interests. He's been involved in several land disputes in other territories, always working for the side with the most money and the fewest scruples." Beth felt a chill of recognition. Her memory contained details of several recent incidents where property owners had suddenly decided to sell their land to Hayes Company after refusing previous offers. At the time, she had assumed the sellers had simply reconsidered the financial benefits. Now she wondered if Donnelly's presence might have influenced their decisions. "What about the older man with expensive clothes?" "That's Theodore Blackwell, Senator Harrison Blackwood's brother. He represents Eastern financial interests that are heavily invested in territorial development. His presence suggests that Hayes has connections reaching all the way to the federal commission that's supposedly conducting an impartial investigation." The implication struck Beth with the force of physical blows. The federal commission wasn't an independent investigation but a mechanism for legitimizing a predetermined outcome. Hayes and his associates had arranged for friendly federal oversight that would validate their version of territorial history while dismissing inconvenient claims that lacked documentation. "There's something else," Patterson continued. "I've been asking questions about the night of the fire, and several people mentioned seeing you near the territorial building that evening. Some are suggesting that your observations might have been more than coincidental." Beth's heart began racing. "What do you mean?" "People are starting to wonder how you happened to be awake and watching at exactly the right time to see the midnight riders. They're suggesting that perhaps you knew something was going to happen." The accusation was both unfair and dangerous. Beth had indeed been awake due to her restless thoughts about the territorial situation, but she certainly hadn't known about any planned fire. However, explaining her wakefulness would require her to admit to the level of detailed concern about territorial politics that had kept her from sleeping. "I sometimes have difficulty sleeping," she said carefully. "When I heard horses at an unusual hour, I looked out to see what was happening. There was nothing suspicious about my curiosity." Patterson studied her face with his journalist's trained eye for detecting deception. "I believe you, Miss Campbell, but others might be less charitable in their interpretations, especially if they have reasons to prefer that witnesses remain silent. The warning was clear. Beth's position as a witness to the Midnight Riders was becoming dangerous as Hayes and his associates consolidated their control over the territorial situation. Men who would burn official records might not hesitate to silence inconvenient witnesses. "What would you advise?" she asked quietly. "Be very careful about who you trust and what you say publicly. But also consider that your testimony might be the only thing standing between this community and a complete takeover by corrupt interests." After Patterson left, Beth found herself facing the full magnitude of her dilemma. Her perfect memory contained the knowledge needed to expose Hayes' conspiracy and preserve legitimate property rights. But using that knowledge would expose her gift and potentially cost her life. Yet remaining silent would allow injustice to triumph and would betray the trust of a community that had been her home for 28 years. As darkness fell over Cedar Falls Territory, Elizabeth Campbell sat in her kitchen with a single oil lamp for company, contemplating a choice that would determine not only her own future but the fate of everyone who called the territory home. Outside, the sounds of evening settled over the community, normal sounds that disguised the extraordinary crisis building beneath the surface of daily life. The living library remained closed, its knowledge vast and precise, while the forces of corruption gathered strength for their final assault on the legal foundations of territorial society. Soon Beth would have to decide whether her gift was a blessing to be shared or a burden to be hidden, regardless of the consequences for herself or her community. The fourth morning after the fire brought an unexpected visitor to Elizabeth Campbell's door. Judge Thomas Miller stood on her porch in the pre-dawn darkness, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. His white hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his normally steady hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. "Miss Campbell," he said quietly, "forgive the unusual hour, but I need to speak with you about a matter of utmost importance." Beth invited him inside, noting the deep worry lines etched across his weathered face. As she prepared coffee in the dim lamplight, Judge Miller paced restlessly through her small kitchen, his agitation palpable. "I've spent the night reviewing what little documentation survived the fire," he began without preamble. "A few scattered papers that were stored in my personal files, some copies of court decisions that residents kept in their homes. What I've found is deeply disturbing." Beth poured coffee into 2 cups, her perfect memory already cataloging every detail of the judge's appearance and demeanor. "What kind of disturbances?" "Discrepancies between what people are now claiming about their property rights and what I remember from the original documents. Several individuals have approached me with descriptions of land boundaries that don't match my recollection of the surveys and deeds. More troubling, these discrepancies all favor the same interests." Judge Miller accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup as though seeking comfort as much as warmth. "Miss Campbell, I understand that you've lived in Cedar Falls your entire life. You've had occasion to observe many of the transactions and agreements that shaped our community's development." The statement felt like a test, and Beth chose her words carefully. "I've seen some things over the years, enough to know that not everyone's current claims match what was originally established. Could you be more specific about what you've observed?" Beth felt the familiar tension between her desire to help and her need to protect her secret. Judge Miller represented legitimate authority and had a reputation for fairness, but revealing the full extent of her knowledge would expose her gift to someone with the power to compel her testimony in public proceedings. "I remember when the Peterson Ranch was surveyed," she said carefully. "The boundary markers were placed along the creek bed, not 50 yards inland as they're now claiming. And the Mitchell mining claim was limited to the eastern slope of Bear Mountain, not the entire ridge, as they've been telling people." Judge Miller's eyes sharpened with interest. "Those are very specific details, Miss Campbell. Are you certain of your recollections?" Beth felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had provided information that was more precise than most people could remember about events from years earlier. "I have a good memory for things that interested me. Property disputes tend to create lasting impressions." "Indeed they do, and your memory appears to be remarkably accurate." The judge set down his coffee cup and studied Beth's face with obvious curiosity. "Miss Campbell, I'm going to share something with you that I haven't told anyone else." Yesterday I received a private communication from Senator Blackwood regarding the federal commission he's sending to investigate our situation. Beth maintained a calm expression while her mind raced with the implications. Any private communication between the supposedly impartial federal investigator and local officials suggested that the investigation might be less objective than publicly claimed. The senator expressed particular concern about what he called unreliable local testimony that might confuse the commission's work. He suggested that the most helpful approach would be to focus on clear documented claims rather than depending on uncertain memories of complex agreements. The statement was clearly a warning, and Beth understood its implications. The federal commission intended to dismiss any testimony that challenged convenient revisions of territorial history, regardless of how accurate that testimony might be. What does that mean for people whose legitimate claims lack written documentation? She asked. It means they'll likely lose their property rights unless someone can provide extraordinarily detailed and convincing testimony about the original agreements. Judge Miller leaned forward, his expression intense. Miss Campbell, I've been thinking about our conversation about your apparent knowledge of territorial affairs. Is there anything else you might remember about property boundaries or agreements that could help preserve legitimate claims? The question hung in the air between them like a bridge Beth could cross or burn. Judge Miller was offering her the opportunity to use her knowledge to prevent injustice, but accepting that opportunity would expose her gift and potentially put her life in danger. I remember some things, she said slowly, but I'm not sure how much weight my testimony would carry against organized opposition. More than you might think, especially if your recollections prove accurate when tested against what little documentation remains.
Spent the afternoon in intense contemplation. The minister's visit had clarified the moral dimensions of her situation, but it had not made her choice easier. She possessed knowledge that could preserve legitimate property rights, protect tribal agreements, and prevent a complete takeover of territorial governance by corrupt interests. But using that knowledge would expose her to retaliation from dangerous men who viewed her memory as a threat to their plans. As evening approached, Beth made a decision that would change the trajectory of her quiet life forever. She would begin to reveal her knowledge, but carefully and strategically, working with trusted allies who could help protect her while using her memory to preserve the legal foundations of territorial society. The first step would be to provide Judge Miller with specific information about the Beaver Creek Accords, information detailed enough to challenge the false claims being made by Hayes' associates. If her testimony proved effective in that case, she would gradually expand her contributions, always working through established legal channels and trusted intermediaries. Beth spent the evening reviewing her memories of the Beaver Creek negotiations, organizing her recollections into the kind of systematic account that could stand up to hostile questioning. Her perfect memory contained not just the final terms of the agreements, but the entire process of negotiation, including the concerns expressed by both sides and the compromises that had been reached to address those concerns. As she worked, Beth became aware of unusual activity on the street outside her cabin. Men on horseback moved past her windows more frequently than normal, their pace suggesting patrol activity rather than routine travel. The sensation of being watched, which had troubled her for days, intensified as darkness fell. Around 10 o'clock, Beth heard the distinct sound of someone testing her door handle. She extinguished her oil lamp and moved silently to the window, peering carefully through a crack in the curtains. 3 men stood on her front porch, their faces hidden in shadow but their postures suggesting hostile intent. One of the men was clearly Marcus Donnelly, his distinctive red hair visible in the moonlight. The other 2 were strangers, but they carried themselves with the alert wariness of professional enforcers. All 3 were armed, their weapons clearly visible despite the darkness. Beth retreated from the window and considered her options. Her cabin had a back door that led to her small garden, but reaching it would require her to cross the main room where the men might observe her movement through the windows. Alternatively, she could remain hidden and hope they would eventually leave without attempting to enter. The decision was made for her when she heard the soft sound of metal against metal, suggesting that someone was attempting to pick the lock on her front door. Beth moved as quietly as possible toward the back of the cabin,
gathering her father's pistol from its hiding place in her bedroom chest. She had learned to shoot as a child and had maintained her skills through regular practice, understanding that frontier life sometimes required women to defend themselves. As she reached the kitchen, the front door opened with barely audible creaking. Beth could see the silhouettes of the three men as they entered her home, moving with the practiced stealth of people accustomed to such intrusions. "Search everything," she heard one of them whisper. "Any papers, notebooks, anything she might have written down." "What about the woman herself?" another voice asked. "The boss wants to talk to her. Bring her if she's here, but don't leave any obvious signs of a struggle." Beth understood that remaining in the cabin would mean capture, and she had no illusions about what Hayes' associates might do to silence an inconvenient witness. She opened the back door as quietly as possible and slipped into her garden, grateful for the vegetable rows that provided some concealment from the cabin windows. Moving carefully through the darkness, Beth made her way to the small shed behind her garden where she stored tools and supplies. From there she could observe the cabin while remaining hidden from the intruders. Through the windows she could see the men methodically searching her possessions by lamplight, examining her few books and papers, looking for evidence of the knowledge they suspected she possessed. After 20 minutes, the men concluded their search and departed, apparently satisfied that Beth was not currently at home but clearly planning to return. As their footsteps faded into the distance, Beth remained in her hiding place, understanding that her quiet life in Cedar Falls Territory had ended forever. The living library had been discovered by those who viewed knowledge as a threat to their ambitions. Now Beth faced the choice between fleeing to safety or staying to fight for the community that had been her home for 28 years. In her hiding place behind the garden shed, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the Montana night, Elizabeth Campbell began to plan her strategy for using her extraordinary gift to preserve walls, legal foundations of territorial society. The battle for the soul of Cedar Falls was about to begin in earnest, and the woman with perfect memory would play a central role in determining its outcome. Whether that role would lead to justice or tragedy remained to be seen, but Beth understood that there could be no return to the comfortable anonymity that had protected her for so many years. The federal commission would arrive in 2 days, and with it would come the final confrontation between those who sought to preserve legitimate governance and those who viewed the destroyed records as an opportunity for unlimited exploitation. Beth's memory contained the weapons needed for that battle, but using those weapons would require courage that she had never been forced to summon before. As midnight approached, Beth crept back to her violated cabin and began to prepare for a fight that would determine not only her own future but the fate of everyone who called Cedar Falls Territory home. The quiet seamstress was about to become the most important witness in the territory's history. Whether she survived the experience or not, dawn broke over Cedar Falls Territory with an urgency that seemed to match the crisis gripping the community. Elizabeth Campbell emerged from her hiding place in the garden shed as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the mountains surrounding the valley. Her cabin stood violated but intact, its windows reflecting the morning light like accusing eyes that had witnessed too much. Beth moved cautiously through her ransacked home, cataloging the damage with the same perfect precision that governed every aspect of her memory. Her few books had been pulled from their shelves and scattered across the floor. Her sewing supplies had been dumped from their containers and examined piece by piece. Even her grandmother's quilt had been unfolded and searched for hidden papers or documents. The message was unmistakably clear. William Hayes and his associates knew that she possessed dangerous knowledge, and they were prepared to take increasingly aggressive measures to neutralize that threat. The careful search suggested they were still hoping to find written records of what she remembered, not yet understanding that her knowledge existed only in the extraordinary capacity of her mind. As Beth began to restore order to her belongings, she heard footsteps approaching her front door. Her hand moved instinctively toward her father's pistol, but the gentle knock that followed carried no threat of violence. "Miss Campbell," Judge Miller's voice called softly, "are you safe?" Beth opened the door to find not only the judge but also Sheriff Cooper, James Patterson, and Minister Walker, their faces etched with concern and determination. Behind them stood Daniel Whitebear and Susan Baker, forming an unlikely alliance of authority figures, intellectuals and community leaders. "We heard about the intrusion," Sheriff Cooper said grimly as they entered the disrupted cabin. "Mrs. Johnson saw men leaving your property around midnight, and alerted us immediately." Beth felt a wave of gratitude toward her elderly neighbor, whose vigilance might have saved her from capture or worse. "They were searching for papers, documents, anything that might contain the information they believe I possess." Judge Miller surveyed the ransacked interior with obvious anger. "This confirms our worst fears about the lengths these men will go to silence opposition. Miss Campbell, we've come to offer you protection and to discuss how your knowledge might be used to preserve legitimate governance in our territory." The assembled group represented the core of honest authority in Cedar Falls Territory, and Beth understood that the moment for half-truths and careful evasions had passed. These people needed to know exactly what she could contribute to their fight against Hayes and his corrupt federal allies. "Before we proceed," she said quietly, "there's something you need to understand about my memory. It's not simply good or detailed, it's perfect. I remember everything I've ever seen, heard or experienced with complete accuracy." The statement hung in the air like a revelation that transformed everything they thought they knew about their quiet seamstress neighbor. Minister Walker was the first to speak, his voice filled with wonder rather than disbelief. "The Lord has blessed you with an extraordinary gift, Miss Campbell. No wonder Hayes and his associates see you as such a threat to their plans." James Patterson's journalistic instincts immediately grasped the implications. "You remember the exact terms of every land deed, every treaty agreement, every court decision that shaped territorial governance." "Every word," Beth confirmed. "Every detail of every negotiation, survey and legal proceeding I witnessed or heard described. The territorial records may have been destroyed, but they exist completely intact in my memory." Sheriff Cooper let out a low whistle of amazement. "That means you could reconstruct the entire legal foundation of the territory from memory alone. Which is exactly why Hayes had your cabin searched," Daniel Whitebear observed grimly. "A perfect witness to the true history of territorial agreements poses an existential threat to his plans for rewriting that history." Susan Baker, ever practical in her teacher's approach to problems, immediately began considering the logistics. "How do we use this knowledge effectively while keeping Miss Campbell safe from retaliation?" Judge Miller had been quietly absorbing the magnitude of what Beth had revealed. Now he stepped forward with the authority of his office and the urgency of their situation. "Miss Campbell, the federal commission arrives this afternoon. Senator Blackwood intends to conduct what he calls expedited hearings to resolve territorial governance issues quickly and definitively. Based on my communications with him, I believe those hearings are designed to legitimize predetermined outcomes that favor Hayes and his associates." Beth nodded, her memory providing complete recall of every suspicious element in the commission's announced procedures. "They'll dismiss any testimony that challenges their preferred version of territorial history, claiming that individual memories are too unreliable to overcome the absence of written documentation." "Exactly. Unless we can present them with testimony so detailed and comprehensive that it cannot be dismissed as uncertain recollection." The judge paused, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "Miss Campbell, would you be willing to serve as a witness before the federal commission?" The question carried implications that reached far beyond a simple court appearance. Testifying before the commission would expose Beth's gift to scrutiny from hostile federal officials and their local allies. It would make her a permanent target for retaliation from men who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. "If I testify," Beth said carefully, "Hayes and his associates will do everything in their power to discredit my testimony and silence me permanently." "We understand the risks," Sheriff Cooper replied. "That's why we're here to offer you protection and support. You won't face this alone." Minister Walker placed a gentle hand on Beth's shoulder. "Sometimes the Lord calls us to tasks that require great courage, Miss Campbell. But He also provides us with the strength and allies we need to accomplish His purposes." Beth looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing determination, hope, and genuine concern for both her welfare and the future of their community. These were people who had chosen to stand against corruption despite the personal costs involved. "What would you need from me?" she asked quietly. Judge Miller's expression showed both relief and renewed purpose. Complete testimony about the key agreements that Hayes is attempting to invalidate. The Beaver Creek Tribal Accords, the major mining claims along Eagle Ridge, the railroad right-of-way negotiations, the homestead boundaries that are being disputed. I can provide exact details about all of those agreements and many others, Beth confirmed. But Hayes will challenge my credibility, claim that no human memory could be as detailed as mine appears to be. James Patterson smiled with the confidence of a reporter who had found the perfect angle for his story. That's where documentation becomes crucial. We'll test your memory against every scrap of surviving records, every partial copy that residents might have kept. When your recollections prove accurate in every verifiable detail, the Commission will have to acknowledge the reliability of your testimony about agreements that lack surviving documentation. The strategy was sound, but Beth understood that its success would depend on her ability to withstand hostile questioning from federal officials who had already decided what conclusions they wanted to reach. There's another factor to consider, Daniel Whitebear added thoughtfully. If Miss Campbell's testimony succeeds in preserving legitimate agreements, it will set a precedent that threatens similar schemes in other territories. The men behind this corruption won't give up easily, even if they lose this particular battle. The observation highlighted the broader implications of their fight. Success in Cedar Falls Territory might save their community, but it would also make them permanent enemies of powerful interests that operated across the entire western frontier. Susan Baker, with her teacher's instinct for practical planning, addressed the immediate challenges they faced. The Commission hearings begin at 2 o'clock this afternoon in the town hall. That gives us 6 hours to prepare Miss Campbell's testimony and organize our evidence. I'll coordinate with my deputies to provide security, Sheriff Cooper added. But we should assume that Hayes will attempt to disrupt the proceedings through intimidation or worse. As the group began to disperse to make their preparations, Beth remained with Judge Miller to discuss the specific legal framework for her testimony. The judge's experience and integrity would be crucial in presenting her knowledge in ways that federal commissioners couldn't dismiss. Miss Campbell, he said as they reviewed the legal precedents for witness testimony, I want you to understand what we're asking of you. This testimony will change your life permanently. Even if we succeed in preserving territorial governance, you'll never again be able to live quietly as just another community member. Beth had already reached the same conclusion. Her gift, once revealed, would make her either a valuable resource or a dangerous threat, depending on the interests of those who sought to use or silence her. Judge Miller, she replied, I've spent 28 years hiding my memory because I feared how it would change my life. But watching Hayes and his associates attempt to destroy everything good about our community has shown me that some changes are worth the cost they require. The judge nodded with obvious respect for her decision. Then let's make sure your sacrifice achieves its purpose. The morning hours passed quickly as Beth organized her memories into systematic testimony that could withstand the most hostile examination. Her perfect recall allowed her to structure her knowledge chronologically, thematically, and by legal significance, creating multiple frameworks that reinforced the accuracy and comprehensiveness of her recollections. James Patterson arrived at midday with news that added urgency to their preparations. Hayes has brought in additional men from outside the territory. I count at least 15 strangers who arrived on this morning's stage, all of them carrying themselves like professional gunmen. Whatever happens at the hearings, he's prepared to enforce his version of events through violence if necessary. The information confirmed Beth's understanding that the Federal Commission represented the last chance for legitimate resolution of territorial governance issues. If her testimony failed to convince the commissioners, the community would face a choice between submission to corrupt authority or open resistance that could lead to widespread violence. Sheriff Cooper joined them as Beth put the finishing touches on her preparation. My deputies are positioned around the town hall, but we're outnumbered if Hayes decides to use force. Our best protection is success in the legal proceedings. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Beth emerged from her violated cabin, dressed in her finest dress, a dark blue wool garment that conveyed both respectability and serious purpose. Her hair was arranged in a severe bun that emphasized the intelligent determination in her brown eyes. She carried herself with quiet dignity as she walked toward the town hall, flanked by her protectors and allies. The town hall had been transformed for the federal hearings. Senator Harrison Blackwood sat at a raised table with 2 other commissioners, their Eastern clothing and formal bearing emphasizing their authority over territorial affairs. William Hayes occupied a prominent position among the spectators, surrounded by his associates and the gunmen Patterson had identified. The hall was packed beyond capacity with settlers, tribal representatives, and townspeople crowding every available space. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone understanding that the proceedings would determine the future of their community for generations to come. Senator Blackwood called the hearings to order with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to wielding federal power. His opening statement made clear his intention to resolve territorial governance issues quickly and definitively, with minimal tolerance for what he called uncertain local testimony about unverifiable agreements. The destruction of territorial records requires us to establish new documentation based on clear evidence rather than conflicting memories, he announced. This commission will focus on claims that can be substantiated through reliable sources and contemporary documentation. Judge Miller rose to present Beth's testimony, his dignity and legal experience lending weight to their cause. Commissioners, the territory respectfully presents Miss Elizabeth Campbell, a lifelong resident whose extraordinary memory provides comprehensive documentation of the agreements and boundaries that have governed our community's development. Senator Blackwood's expression showed immediate skepticism. Judge Miller, while we appreciate Miss Campbell's willingness to assist our investigation, individual memory is notoriously unreliable, particularly regarding complex legal agreements from years past. If I may demonstrate the reliability of Miss Campbell's recollections, Judge Miller replied smoothly, we have prepared a series of tests using surviving partial documentation to verify the accuracy of her memory. The next hour transformed the hearing room into a courtroom battle between corruption and truth. Beth answered increasingly detailed questions about territorial agreements, her responses checked against every scrap of surviving documentation. In every case her memory proved flawlessly accurate, down to specific dates, legal language and procedural details that impressed even the skeptical commissioners. William Hayes grew visibly agitated as Beth's credibility became undeniable. His associates whispered urgently among themselves, clearly unprepared for testimony so comprehensive and precise that it could not be dismissed as uncertain recollection. Miss Campbell, Senator Blackwood said finally, his tone grudgingly respectful, assuming your memory is as accurate as these tests suggest, what can you tell us about the Beaver Creek tribal accords that have been the subject of recent disputes? Beth's response was masterful in its precision and authority. She recited the exact terms of the agreements, the specific language that guaranteed tribal access rights, the boundaries that had been established through careful surveying, and the federal ratification process that had made the accords legally binding under United States law. Furthermore, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, the recent claims that these accords were merely preliminary agreements lack any foundation in fact. I was present when federal commissioners explicitly stated that the agreements being signed represented permanent legal arrangements that would be honored by territorial and federal authority. Daniel Whitebear's expression showed profound relief as Beth's testimony validated every element of tribal claims that Hayes had attempted to dispute. Around the hall, other community members began to understand that their own property rights and legal protections were being preserved by the quiet seamstress who had hidden her extraordinary gift for so many years. But Hayes was not finished. As Beth concluded her testimony about the Beaver Creek Accords, he rose from his seat with the confidence of a man who believed he still held winning cards. Commissioners, he said smoothly, while Miss Campbell's performance is impressive, I submit that such detailed recollection is humanly impossible. No individual could remember such specific information about events from years past, unless they had access to written records that they are now claiming to recall from memory. The accusation struck at the heart of Beth's credibility. suggesting that she was perpetrating an elaborate deception rather than demonstrating genuine perfect recall. Senator Blackwood leaned forward with renewed interest in Hayes' challenge. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Hayes. Are you suggesting that Miss Campbell has somehow fabricated her testimony based on hidden documents?" "I'm suggesting that the commissioners investigate how a simple seamstress could possess more detailed knowledge of territorial law than trained government officials, unless she had access to resources she's not acknowledging." The challenge forced Beth to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could attempt to explain her gift in terms that might preserve some privacy and protection, or she could reveal the full truth about her perfect memory, and accept whatever consequences followed. "Commissioner Blackwood," she said quietly, rising from the witness chair with calm dignity, "I possess what physicians call total recall or perfect memory. I remember every word of every conversation I have ever heard, every document I have ever seen, every experience I have ever had, with complete accuracy and perfect detail." The admission created a stunned silence in the packed hall. Such perfect memory was rare enough to be almost mythical, yet Beth's demonstrated accuracy made denial impossible. "If Mr. Hayes doubts my abilities," she continued, "I invite him to test them. Ask me about any public event, any conversation he has had in my presence, any document that was read aloud in community meetings. I will provide exact recollection that can be verified by other witnesses." Hayes' confident expression faltered as he realized the trap he had created for himself. Testing Beth's memory might prove her extraordinary abilities, but it would also expose details of his own activities that he preferred to keep hidden. Furthermore, Beth said, her voice gaining strength as she accepted the full implications of her revelation, "My memory contains detailed recollections of conversations between Mr. Hayes and his associates about their plans to exploit the destruction of territorial records for personal profit." The accusation electrified the hearing room. Senator Blackwood's expression shifted from skepticism to sharp interest as he recognized the potential significance of Beth's testimony. "Miss Campbell, are you alleging criminal conspiracy in connection with the fire that destroyed territorial records?" "I'm testifying about conversations I overheard in which Mr. Hayes and his associates discussed the benefits that would result from the absence of official documentation. I can provide exact quotes, specific dates, and detailed descriptions of the participants in these discussions." Hayes leaped to his feet in obvious panic. "This is preposterous. The commissioners can't seriously consider the fantasies of a disturbed woman who claims impossible abilities." But his protests only drew more attention to Beth's accusations. Judge Miller seized the opportunity to press their advantage. "Commissioners, if Miss Campbell's memory has proven accurate in every detail that can be verified, shouldn't her testimony about unverifiable matters be given equal credence? And if her recollections include evidence of criminal conspiracy, doesn't that warrant investigation?" The federal commissioners found themselves in an impossible position. Beth's perfect memory had been demonstrated beyond doubt, making her accusations impossible to dismiss. Yet accepting her testimony would require them to acknowledge that the entire purpose of their mission had been based on false premises created by the very corruption she was exposing. Senator Blackwood called a recess to consider the unexpected developments, but the damage to Hayes' plans was already irreversible. Community members who had feared losing their property rights now understood that their legal protections were documented in the mind of their quiet neighbor. Tribal representatives saw their access rights validated by
testimony that could not be challenged or dismissed. During the recess, Hayes made one final desperate attempt to silence the witness whose memory had destroyed his carefully constructed schemes. As Beth stood with her protectors near the front of the hall, Marcus Donnelly and two other gunmen pushed through the crowd toward her. Sheriff Cooper and his deputies moved to intercept them, but the packed hall made quick movement impossible. The confrontation that had been building for days was about to explode into violence that could destroy any hope of legitimate resolution. But Hayes had underestimated the transformation his corruption had created in the community. As his gunmen approached Beth, dozens of ordinary citizens stepped between them and their target.
Ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, and townspeople formed a protective barrier around the woman whose memory had become their shield against injustice. "Stand aside," Donnelly snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon. "This doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," George Thompson the blacksmith replied grimly. "Miss Campbell is protecting all our rights. Anyone who threatens her threatens every honest person in this territory." The confrontation escalated rapidly as more citizens joined the protective barrier around Beth. Hayes' gunmen found themselves facing not a single vulnerable witness but an entire community united in defense of truth and legitimate governance. Senator Blackwood recognized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The federal commission that was supposed to legitimize predetermined outcomes had instead exposed the very corruption it was meant to conceal. "Order," he shouted, pounding his gavel repeatedly. "This hearing will reconvene with proper security measures. Sheriff Cooper, clear the hall of all non-essential persons and ensure that witnesses can testify without intimidation." As the town hall was reorganized under Sheriff Cooper's authority, Hayes found his position fundamentally transformed. His gunmen were outnumbered by an aroused community. His federal allies were embarrassed by the exposure of their corruption. His carefully laid plans had been destroyed by the perfect memory of a woman he had fatally underestimated. When the hearings resumed, Senator Blackwood's approach had changed completely. Rather than dismissing local testimony, he now focused on documenting the extent of the conspiracy Beth had revealed. Her perfect memory provided a comprehensive record of Hayes' activities, his coordination with corrupt federal officials, and his plans to exploit the destroyed records for personal profit. "Miss Campbell," the senator said finally, "your testimony has provided this commission with evidence of serious federal crimes related to territorial governance. We will be recommending criminal prosecution for conspiracy, fraud, and corruption of federal processes." Hayes' empire of corruption collapsed in a single afternoon, destroyed by the memory of a woman who had spent years hiding her gift but who finally chose to use it in service of justice. His associates were arrested, his plans exposed, and his influence over territorial affairs permanently ended. As evening fell over Cedar Falls Territory, Elizabeth Campbell stood on the steps of the town hall surrounded by neighbors who now understood the extraordinary gift she had used to preserve their community. Her quiet life was indeed over, but in its place had emerged a new role as the living guardian of territorial history. Judge Miller approached her as the crowd began to disperse. "Miss Campbell, I know this day has changed everything for you, but I hope you understand how many people you've helped by choosing courage over safety." Beth nodded, her perfect memory already cataloging every detail of the day's events for future recall. "Judge Miller, I spent so many years fearing how my gift might change my life that I almost lost the opportunity to use it for something meaningful." James Patterson joined them, his notebook filled with the story that would transform him from a frontier journalist into a nationally recognized chronicler of Western justice. "Miss Campbell, if you're willing, I'd like to document your role in preserving territorial governance. Your story deserves to be told." "The story belongs to all of us," Beth replied. "I just happened to be the one who remembered it accurately." Minister Walker appeared at her side, his expression filled with the satisfaction of a man who had witnessed divine purpose fulfilled through human courage. "Miss Campbell, you've shown us all what it means to use our gifts in service of others. Your memory has become a blessing not just to yourself but to every person in this territory." Daniel Whitebear joined the small group, his dignified bearing reflecting the gratitude of tribal communities whose rights had been preserved by Beth's testimony. "Miss Campbell, my people understand that some individuals are blessed with special responsibilities to their communities. You have honored that responsibility with courage and wisdom." Susan Baker, ever practical, was already considering the future implications of Beth's revealed gift. "Miss Campbell, the territorial government will need to establish new procedures for documenting and preserving legal agreements. Your memory could serve as the foundation for rebuilding our administrative systems." As the group discussed the challenges and opportunities ahead, Beth found herself thinking about the choice she had made and its consequences. Her quiet life as a seamstress was indeed over, but in its place had emerged a new existence as the living library of territorial history. The Federal Commission departed the next morning with recommendations that would transform territorial governance throughout the western frontier. Senator Blackwood's final report praised the role of citizen testimony in preserving legitimate governance and recommended new protections for communities threatened by corrupt schemes. William Hayes and his surviving associates were transported to federal custody, facing prosecution for conspiracy and corruption that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences. Marcus Donnelly and his fellow gunmen were charged with intimidation and attempted violence against federal witnesses. In the weeks that followed, Beth worked with territorial officials to document the complete history of Cedar Falls governance based on her perfect memory. Her recollections became the foundation for new legal frameworks that protected both individual property rights and tribal access agreements. The story of the living library spread throughout the territory and beyond, inspiring other communities to recognize and protect the knowledge held by their own longtime residents. Beth's example demonstrated that extraordinary gifts, when used with courage and wisdom, could serve as powerful forces for justice and legitimate governance. As autumn settled over the Montana mountains, Elizabeth Campbell found herself in a position she had never imagined. No longer the quiet seamstress hiding her remarkable memory, she had become a respected figure whose testimony carried the weight of absolute accuracy, and whose knowledge served as the foundation for territorial law. Her cabin, once violated by those who sought to silence her, became a place of pilgrimage for officials, historians, and citizens seeking accurate information about territorial development. Beth welcomed these visitors with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, understanding that her gift had been transformed from a private burden into a public service. The choice to reveal her perfect memory had indeed changed everything about her life, but it had also preserved the legal foundations that protected everyone in Cedar Falls Territory. Sometimes, Beth reflected as she worked in her restored garden, the greatest gifts are those that serve purposes larger than our own comfort and safety. The living library had opened its treasures to the world, and in doing so had helped preserve the dream of honest governance that made frontier communities worth defending. Elizabeth Campbell's extraordinary memory would continue to serve her community for decades to come, a testament to the power of truth over corruption and the courage required to use our gifts in service of justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.